Welcome back to the FITSNews studios for another edition of Your Week in Review. A ton of stuff to cover this week. We're going to dive right in. Murdoch murders. The big news this week, the sentencing of convicted fraudster Russell Lafitte. I'm going to speak with Dylan Nolan, our multimedia reporter, who was covering this trial from the very beginning. He's going to talk about whether this sentence was expected, not expected, and some insights from the big sentencing hearing down in Charleston, South Carolina this past week. I'm also going to speak with Jen Wood, our research director. We're going to go through an inventory of all the outstanding Murdoch cases so we can keep you up to speed on the federal, state, civil, criminal, which cases have been settled, which are still pending, which charges are hanging out there. We're going to give you the full inventory so you can be prepared for what's next in this saga. I'm also going to talk about a tragedy that took place in Colleton County last month. We've covered it here on the show before, the Green Pond Massacre. This story, we found out so much more about it this week, and it leads directly into a conversation about this preventable scourge of violent crime in South Carolina. We've got to fix the state's broken justice system, and there is a growing course to do that. We're going to talk about that as well. Last but not least, we sat down with Candace Carroll from Americans Prosperity. She's the state director for this group here in South Carolina, and we spoke at length about the upcoming 2024 presidential election and her group's role in that race. Stay tuned for all that and more on a busy edition of Your Week in Review. All right, so we talked about it on last week's show, but the big news in the Murdoch murders, crime, and corruption saga this week, the sentencing of convicted fraudster Russell Lafitte, the former president of Palmetto State Bank, a key cog in the financial fleecings of convicted killer Alec Murdaugh. Dylan Nolan, our multimedia journalist, special projects director, you were down there for the trial last November, but also for the sentencing this past week. You've been covering this from the beginning. Let me ask you, were you expecting this amount of time for Russell Lafitte, or did you think 7 years was the low end of what he was going to get?
I mean, we were talking to our sources before this hearing, trying to figure out what to expect, and we were expecting somewhere around a decade, give or take, I would say 2 to 3 years on either side. So this is definitely on the low end, but it wasn't crazy in either direction. I would say it was interesting to watch the prosecutors leave and the Lafitte family leave, because I think the prosecutors were happy. This is finally over. Russell Lafitte is actually going to jail. He has been sentenced, and it will happen. And I think that they were happy with the amount of time. In fact, I know that because they came out in front of the court and said that. But also the Lafitte family, while nobody looks happy when they're sentenced to 7 years in federal prison, I think just judging by their demeanor, they know that it could have been a lot worse.
And some say should have been a lot worse, because here's a guy who at every step of this process, if you read the pre-sentencing motions from prosecutors, was refusing to take responsibility, was obfuscating, was refusing to take any blame for what he'd done. And a lot of folks thought that would lead to perhaps a longer sentence.
Well, it did in a way. I mean, the government offered him a plea deal, which early on in this process, which he refused. He rejected it, wanting to take it to trial, which he lost. But like you say, if he had admitted his guilt, something that a jury of his peers say, okay, you're guilty of this, so clearly there's something there. If he had admitted that, he could be well through, I think, past the halfway point of that bid at this point. Instead, he's not even in jail right now. They're going to tell him when to report. So he's well behind where he could have been if he had cooperated with law enforcement earlier.
Indeed, and we want to point out a 7-year sentence, but in the federal system, there's no parole, but there are good behavior credits. I think it's 54 days for each year of the sentence, so you add that up, it's basically 1 year. If he keeps his nose clean behind bars, he'll be able to serve a 6-year sentence. But you heard, Dylan, down there in Charleston, family members of Lafitte, supporters of Lafitte, but also from those he ripped off. What were your takeaways from listening to the testimony of those individuals, both for and against Lafitte?
So it's interesting. If the folks that are listening to this haven't seen a sentencing hearing, you'll get an opportunity for both parties to speak. And when his family and friends were talking, they highlighted a lot of things about Russell, which I believe are true, which Judge Gergel even said as he was handing down this sentence. Look, I believe that everything that your friends and family came up here and said today is true, that Russell Lafitte was incredibly generous with his time, with his friends, with his associates, with his people that he met. But the flip side of that is that it's also obvious that there are these people that were extremely vulnerable, that he had under his care that did not understand the financial system even 1/10 as well as he does to be able to protect themselves, that he completely ripped off and abused their trust. And that's just not something that somebody, especially that's running a bank, the chief executive of a bank, can be allowed to do.
And you talked about that kind of duality of Russell Lafitte. He's involved in the charity for folks with special needs, and then on the other hand, he's ripping off Hakeem Pinckney, a quadriplegic.
Yeah, I was sitting there listening to this in court. One of his friends came up, a guy who it seems like Russell Lafitte has been a very good friend to, which, I that's a great thing. People need to have good friends in their life. I'm not faulting Russell for this, but when your friend comes up there and the thing they talk about to talk about your good character is your participation in a special needs society, the Hampton Special Needs Foundation, that's great. I'm really glad that Russell did that. He doesn't have special needs children from what I can tell. It seems like he was doing this just because he is somebody who cares about his community. But to, at the same time, be ripping off a quadriplegic, that is, and the judge knows this, of course, he's intimately familiar. The person he ripped off's mom is there, who's going to talk later. So it just felt rich. I'm not going to lie to you.
And as they left the court, you mentioned earlier, Emily Limehouse, the lead prosecutor, talked about how they were satisfied with the sentence, that
Yes.
white-collar sentences, lengthy white-collar sentences are not easy to get. And we heard both from Limehouse, from U.S. Attorney Adair Ford Burroughs, her boss. We kept hearing this term, send a message. They hope this sends a message. As you watched this trial unfold, Dylan, and saw the consequences that finally came down on Russell Lafitte, what do you think that message is?
Well, I'd like to back up to something that Judge Gergel said in court, and that is that if it weren't for the death of Mallory Beach and the exposition of the Murdaugh crime saga, this whole thing might have never come to light. And I think he might even use stronger language, that likely would not have come to light. And the implication is that in all of the rural counties in South Carolina, which most of the counties in South Carolina are rural counties, there's the opportunity for people to be doing similar things. And that's something that we work in this news outlet to expose. But when the light is shined upon the cockroaches, before they can skitter away, if one of them gets stomped on, I think that it does send a message to these people who are abusing their positions of trust throughout the state because they think nobody's going to catch them.
Well, based on what we saw, the team, you remarked on it repeatedly during the trial back in November, the work that Emily Limehouse, Winston Holliday, Kathleen Stout, and that whole team.
Truly impressive.
And in fact, you mentioned that if you were ever going to think about misbehaving financially, that's the last trio that you would want investigating you.
Here is what I'm going to do, and that is follow the law, because I've seen what federal prosecutors can do, and it's scary.
Yeah, and then a tour de force, we've called it, their prosecutorial
Yes.
efforts there. Dylan Nolan, I want to thank you not only for your work in covering that trial, but the analysis you provided from the beginning, during the trial, during the sentencing, and we'll talk about the appeals coming up. We're actually going to talk about that right now. I'm going to get my headphones on as we prepare to talk to Jen Wood. We're going to do a recap, an inventory of all the Murdaugh cases, criminal, civil, state, federal. Here we go with Jen Wood. All right, so Jen Wood, we're diving into this Murdaugh inventory. All these cases, obviously just talking with Dylan about the sentencing in the Russell Lafitte case. We've had Alec Murdaugh in his double homicide case convicted and sentenced as well. So we've got those two cases are now very much in the appeals process. But this is just the beginning of this deluge of litigiousness and associated with this case. Jen, let's start us with the criminal side. Let's start with the state criminal side. What's still on the plate here in the Murdaugh saga?
It's not over till it's over with the Murdochs. Alec is still facing 101 charges at the state level related to his financial crimes. There's supposed to be a status update September 11th in front of Judge Clifton Newman and Beaufort, so we expect to know more. But he had indicated that they would be looking to schedule that, I believe, in November of this year. We also have Corey Fleming. His federal and his state charges are outstanding. We've heard through the grapevine there might be some plea deals in the works for Corey, but as of now, nothing's been finalized. And after Russell Lafitte's sentencing, he still faces his state charges as well. So
he's got a boatload of them.
A lot of them. And that's all just relating to the financial crimes. We also have cousin Eddie Smith, who I think everybody's anxiously waiting to see where that case goes. I do believe that will be a part of the status update September 11th in front of Judge Newman, as well as Jerry Rivers, who is facing charges relating to activity that we think is connected to Alex Murdaugh, but we don't know a lot of details about that. His trial is scheduled August 28th, I believe, in Colleton. And
That's
then
correct.
Spencer Roberts, the same thing. He is scheduled December, let me double check the date, December 18th.
That's right. And those two guys we're talking about, Spencer Roberts and Jerry Rivers. Obviously, this ties into the drug investigation. State Law Enforcement Division agents have previously discussed, their ongoing investigation into the drug element of Alec Murdaugh's activities. Cousin Eddie plays into that as well. And obviously, Cousin Eddie plays in to that infamous September 2021 roadside shooting. He and Alec Murdaugh also facing charges related to that incident. So all that's still hanging out there, isn't it, Jen?
Yep, there are a lot of things hanging out there, and it all ties back to, where did all this money that Alec was taking from clients, where did it go?
Well, give us a little preview of that. You're working up a big report on that. Where are you? What are you seeing?
So, I'm looking at his account activity for the past 11 years, and I was astounded. And this is just his Palmetto State Bank accounts. $29 million went into that account. Just over $29 million went out of that account. So,
over what period? What period of time
so
are we
that
talking?
begins 2010 to when he was indicted in 2021. That is a lot of money. And it's a lot of very interesting transactions to very interesting people.
Well, you've got a big report coming up on that in the coming days, Jim. We don't want to tease that, but as we look past the state criminal charges, what's on the docket federally?
So federally, criminally, correct? We are looking at Corey and Alex are still facing their federal criminal charges. Alex was indicted in May of this year, just after his conviction of the murder of Paul and Maggie Murdoch. And those were, wire fraud, conspiracy, all tied to his financial crimes. And Corey Fleming's facing the same thing related to the Gloria Satterfield settlement.
And there's a little bit of a tug of war going on here, isn't there, between these state and federal prosecutors? Obviously, the state, the high-profile double homicide conviction, got a lot of press, a lot of attention, and certainly the feds with their Russell Lafitte conviction and now sentencing, a lot of attention on that case for them. But there's a little bit of a rivalry here, Jen. Is that the best way to describe it?
I think that might be the only way to describe it. And it's going to be interesting to watch to see how these proceed forward through the courts. What plea deals are made, what transpires leading up to potentially the trials.
And I couldn't help but notice, Jen, as you talked about those drug trials tied to Alec Murdaugh, how quickly you pivoted into the question of where the money went. It seems like you've got a few things you're going to be looking very closely for as those drug trials connected to Murdaugh start to unfold. Again, one of them scheduled here for the end of the month in Colleton County. Obviously, we'll be there. Jen, let's pivot a little bit and talk about the civil side of the ledger, because obviously there is a ton of court filings and motions and cases tied to the civil component of this. The big one, the wrongful death case involving Mallory Beach. A big part of it's been settled, Jim, but not all of it.
No, Alex Murdaugh is still a party to this case. He has not settled his portion. So Parker's convenience store, Parker's Kitchen, they settled through their insurance carrier with the Beach family for $15 million just a couple weeks ago. And, initial reports were that Alex had settled as well, but he has not. They've asked to stay the proceedings pending the outcome of the receiver's investigation of the accounts.
And also the other people on the boat that night, the 4 other survivors of that crash, they have not settled.
Yep. Correct. Maggie Murdoch's estate has settled, so her estate isn't a part of it. But Alex still is tied to these cases, and that case is still open as it relates to Alex Murdaugh.
All right, so we're starting to work our way through this now, but let's talk about what else is left on the civil side. We've got obviously the outrage case. Tell us a little bit about that, Jen, which ties to the boat crash case.
The civil conspiracy case, so Alex is not a part of that case. It is against Greg Parker and those working with him, and it relates to his actions it relates to his actions in regards to the wrongful death lawsuit, and how they handled, discovery. And I think it's going to be a very interesting case, in terms of, what was he doing and why was he doing it? There was the video of Mallory Beach that, her body that was released to, the Discovery Network to promote
Vicky Ward, the journalist.
Vicky Ward. Yep. That was released, and it's believed that it was released to kind of hurt the Beach family, slow their resolve to pursue the lawsuit against Greg Parker. And, they're talking about, knife fighters online trying to change the narrative. And that discovery, Judge Bentley Price is overseeing that, Circuit Court Judge Bentley Price, and he is allowing a lot of that discovery to go forward.
Yeah, some really underhanded stuff by the Parker's crowd, and Valerie Borline of the Wall Street Journal, who has been covering the Murdoch saga. She's got a big book coming out on the Murdoch saga, but she filed a huge report, I believe it was last August, in which
Yes.
Parker basically admitted to a lot of this conduct. So it'll be interesting to see how that outrage case unfolds and some of the tie-ins back to that wrongful death case. But we've also got a ton of federal civil actions too, don't we, Jen?
Yes, so Nautilus Insurance Company, which made the payout in the aftermath of the death of Gloria Satterfield, who was a longtime domestic employee of the Murdochs. She fell in February of 2018 at Moselle, and 3 weeks later, she passed away from injuries from that fall. Immediately after, Alex filed, talked to the boys and her sons and said, you need to file a lawsuit against me, which Corey Fleming handled, and stated that the dogs had caused her fall, which would make him liable as a property owner. And they filed the lawsuit. They didn't get a dime of that money. And afterwards, Nautilus paid out $4 million, and they filed a lawsuit to try and recover that $4 million. So that lawsuit's now in federal court, and it's getting interesting because they have requested to add the Satterfield family as parties to the lawsuit.
It's getting a little testy on that side, isn't it?
Real testy.
The attorneys in that case are clearly sniping a good bit. No love lost between the attorneys in that federal case. But Jen, also let me ask you one last thing before we go. We've talked about a lot of the criminal side. We talked about a lot on the civil side. But there was a podcast that was released last month involving attorney Eric Bland, who is representing the mother of the late Stephen Smith, Sandy Smith. And in that podcast, he confirmed something that we had reported several weeks previously, a development in the Stephen Smith case about how it had been now conclusively determined that Stephen Smith, in fact, died in the roadside where he was found, that his body had not been moved there. And this was, of course, a development that a lot of folks had speculated on, but Bland in that podcast interview confirmed that. Jen, as we look at this and what does that mean for the case of Stephen Smith? Does that mean it's more or less likely that there's a Murdoch connection as it has been repeatedly alleged?
I mean, it has been alleged that the Murdochs were tied to it, but as more and more information comes out, it's looking less and less likely. But, we heard a grand jury was impaneled in that case recently. I don't know the outcome of that grand jury investigation. don't know, he wasn't moved to the road. We know that now, but was he struck by a car? Was he struck by an object? What actually caused his death? I mean, looking at the injuries, I've seen a number of forensic pathologists, medical examiners speak about that, and it does look most likely based on his injuries that he was hit by something going at high speed.
Mm-hmm.
But as far as the Murdochs being involved, I'm not seeing any indications.
Mm-hmm. And again, obviously the speculation there warranted based on how many times the name Murdoch appeared in the investigatory report filed by the South Carolina Highway Patrol in the aftermath of that. So certainly speculation was well-founded, but as that investigation unfolds, Jen, as you pointed out, it seems like it's pointing in another direction. But as we conclude this chat, Jen, I wanted to ask you about this too, because we've talked about the resolved cases that are on appeal. We've talked about the cases that are pending. But let's not forget, you mentioned it just then, that grand jury investigation into the Stephen Smith homicide. There's still a ton of investigatory work going on. So in addition to all the cases we know about, Jen, there could be charges we don't know about coming. Is that
right? I mean, in the aftermath of the death of Mallory Beach, there was an ongoing investigation into Alex Murdaugh regarding abuse of power because he was an assistant solicitor. There still have not been charges filed in that. I think it was made very clear in the murder trial, during testimony, that they have a good bit of evidence in that, and I keep wondering where those charges are. Where are they with those?
Well, we will have to keep our eyes on that and keep tabs on Jen Wood. No one does it better than you. Can't thank you enough for all your work, not only on this case, but all the stories that we're working to uncover here at FITSNews. Jen, thanks for joining us. We'll check back with you in the very near future for additional updates on all these cases.
Thanks for having me.
A little over a month ago, deputies with the Colleton County Sheriff's Office were summoned to 779 Folly Creek Lane in Green Pond, South Carolina. This is an unincorporated community in Colleton County. It's south of Walterboro, South Carolina, where the Murdoch trial we were just talking about took place. But the scene that unfolded at this address on the morning, Sunday, July the 2nd of this year, 2023, one of the most graphic things we've ever covered. It was a stabbing arson incident involving multiple family members, 6 dead, 1 nearly killed, and 1 perpetrator, a butcher by the name of Ryan Leonard Murdaugh of Walterboro, South Carolina. Now, Murdaugh has been charged, or rather he was initially charged, with 2 counts of murder, including 1 of the counts against his own daughter. He was also charged with attempted murder of a 13-year-old girl who barely escaped this house of horrors with her life. Now, this 13-year-old girl, despite being stabbed multiple times and having to be airlifted to a nearby hospital with multiple cuts and stab wounds, she was able to identify Murdaugh to law enforcement. She was able to provide a description of him, a description of the vehicle in which he was traveling, as well as an account of the atrocities that he committed prior to setting that house on fire and taking the lives of 6 people up in smoke with it. Now, Murdaugh was apprehended in large part thanks to the efforts of this 13-year-old young hero. But I want to back up because this case saw additional charges filed this past week. And again, as I mentioned, this was already one of the most horrific stories that we've ever covered, one of the most awful, graphic, gruesome, sinister, savage, pick the word. This crime is it. In fact, I think here as I talk about it, what it's going to be like, we're going to cover this at some point on Fitz Files, our new true crime podcast, and I'm already thinking about, how are we going to handle this thing, because it's even more awful than the stories we're currently telling on that show. But as I think about that and think back, we already knew how bad this crime was. But this past week, it got worse, if you can fathom that. Not only was Murdaugh charged with additional counts of murder in this case, but he was charged with multiple counts of sexual assault, including criminal sexual conduct against minor children. And in addition to that, a count of incest. And again, we don't have all the narratives here. We don't know exactly what these charges entail. And thank God a lot of these charges involving minor children are appropriately sealed. You know, I'm a big transparency and government guy, but this is one of those instances where it's important to protect those victims. But we can see where this case is going. And what I want to bring people back to, because this is, and before we do that, actually, I want to read the names of these victims of Ryan Murdaugh, because this matters. We talk so much about the criminals here. We talk so much about the system that fails us, that enables them, that facilitates crimes like this. But let's talk for a minute about, we talked about the hero who helped lead to his apprehension, but there were 6 people who lost their lives. One of them was Murdaugh's sister-in-law, Michelle Wright, 50 years old. One of them was his own daughter, Saria Murdaugh, 11 years old. Now, Murdaugh had been charged with murder in those cases in the immediate aftermath of the killing, but this past week was charged with 3 additional counts of murder. 3 additional murders. And I want to read the names. We need to remember the victims in these cases. Jefferson Burnell, he was 49 years old. Amos Magwood, he was 73. Shamia Rutledge, 7 years old. And then the one that I don't understand, this is the part of this story that I don't understand. You have a stabbing spree inside this house. You have criminal sexual assault of multiple young girls. You have an incest charge. And again, we know where these are going. But the one I don't understand, 101-year-old Maggie Mackwood. Maggie wasn't stabbed. She was left to watch this. Her death by arson. That's the charge Murdaugh is facing. And again, I suspect we'll have additional charges on this down the road, but just what I can't even fathom. 101 years old. And you die in a house fire after this just gruesome scene. But as we pull back from the horrific facts of this case, I want to talk about the system. We talk about it all the time on this show. All the time. And people still refuse to listen. Powerful people still refuse to listen. They still refuse to change this badly broken joke of a judicial system in South Carolina that perpetually enables violent, dangerous criminals like Murdaugh. A system that repeatedly puts people like him back on the streets with little to zero consequence for their actions. So what do? What do we expect people to do when they realize that the system isn't going to hold them accountable? Shocker. They continue to perpetrate all manner of violence against all manner of victims. We've talked on this show about this case before. I'm not going to dig into all the details, but we've talked about the multiple arrests, convictions, prison time that Murdaugh had on his record. Extensive, a lengthy rap sheet. We talked about a deal that he got from 14th Circuit Solicitor Duffy Stone and Circuit Court Judge Perry Buckner. These names probably sound familiar. They were key cogs in the Murdoch saga we were just talking about. Another case of looking the other way. But in this case, the consequences beyond tragic. But here's the bottom line. Ryan Murdaugh should have been in jail at the time these savage stabbings took place. He should have been behind bars. But he wasn't. Charges were not prosecuted. Charges were not indicted. Now, I've reached out to Duffy Stone. I want to be fair. I've asked Stone twice now to please let us know what were the circumstances of these cases involving Ryan Murdaugh. We want to know. Perhaps there are answers. Heard nothing back from him. Hopefully we will at some point. But I want to turn this mic, all of our microphones over. Because again, there are perspectives, and we want to share those with our audience. But in this case, we see in horrific detail the consequences of something we've been talking about in case after case after case after case all across South Carolina. So while there may be answers here regarding why Solicitor Stone did not press certain charges against Murdaugh, why Judge Perry Buckner did not impose a longer sentence that would have kept him behind bars for the amount of time he deserved, while there may be reasons, those reasons will never explain the chronic denial of justice to hundreds of victims across the state that we've covered over and over and over again for years. For years. There is some hope, though. Over the last few months, we have seen a surge in political action tied to this issue. We've seen lawmakers like Joe White from Newberry, like Heather Bauer from Columbia, like Gilda Cobb-Hunter from Orangeburg. These lawmakers have stood up and said, you know what? Enough is enough. This system where powerful lawyer legislators pick the judges and then get favors from them, which habitually, again, results in these violent criminals being turned loose onto our streets and the re-victimization of victims and the escalation of murders and the erosion of public safety. They've said this system has got to stop. It is not working. Lawyer legislators being in charge of picking judges in the Palmetto State is not working. A few weeks ago in the chair aside from me where I'm sitting, South Carolina Attorney General Alan Wilson stepped up his campaign to fix that system, outlining some specific reforms. And I'd criticized Wilson a bit in the past for not being aggressive enough. He clearly heard that criticism. He has stepped it up, pushing for South Carolina to shift to a federal model. And this past week, we have seen additional support. Dick Harpootlian, one of the most powerful senators, the defense attorney in the Murdoch trial. A lot of people can't stand Harpootlian. A lot of folks in our audience, in fact, view him as an enemy of justice for representing Murdoch. But Dick Harpootlian this week came out in support of advancing reforms to this badly broken system. In fact, he sent a letter to the chairman of the South Carolina Judiciary Committee, Luke Rankin, and said it is time to hold hearings on these multiple bills that have been filed to fix this system. And he wasn't alone either. Mia McLeod, former Democrat, currently an independent South Carolina senator from Richland County, South Carolina, she stepped up, called the current system a, quote, shit show. And I asked her, I said, can I quote you on that? She said, absolutely. She had a few other choice words for that system, not pulling any punches. You know what, people, Mia McLeod, she's one of the more liberal, progressive members of the South Carolina Senate. She and I don't agree. We get along. We don't agree on a whole host of different issues. But I'll tell you something, she has got more stones than the men in that chamber combined. Because she stood up and said, you know what, enough's enough. So you have this growing chorus of calls for reform. And the situation that McLeod and Harpootlian were responding to, I want to tell you a little bit about that because it goes to the very heart of this problem. There's a judge in Richland County, he's a master in equity, who is appointed by the local lawmakers there in Richland County, 16 of them, all Democrats, led by Todd Rutherford, the powerful lawyer legislator who, again, is at the heart of so many of these scandals involving violent criminals being set free. But they kicked this judge out of office because the judge caught a senator's son stealing. Now, did he turn him into the police and have him arrested? No. Did he fire him on the spot? No. Should have. In fact, I've called for an investigation into these thefts because clearly if there's allegations of stealing, I don't care who you are, you or I'd get arrested for that. Why does the senator's son not have charges pressed? But anyway, this kid was allowed to resign, but his father, powerful Senator John Scott, wasn't happy, embarked on a vendetta against this judge, and they illegally removed this judge from office not once, but twice. The first time they did it with a unilateral move by the puppet of Todd Rutherford, the chairman of the Richland County delegation. His name's Leon Howard. That name's not important because he's not the one pulling the strings here. But he unilaterally removed this judge from office against the law, or tried to. The judge went to the Supreme Court and said, nope, can't do that. I'm filing an action against you. So then they came back and said, okay, well, we're going to remove you the right way. But then they held an illegal meeting to remove him. In South Carolina, you got to give 24 hours notice before you hold a public meeting. They didn't do that, and they removed this judge on an illegal vote. And guess what? Props to the Supreme Court. They stopped that too. But the whole situation goes to show, again, this is why. It's not just graphic crimes like the Green Pond Massacre and people who died who didn't have to. Young girls who were violently abused by someone who should have been behind bars. It's not just that. It's the corruption that enables it and perpetuates it. When a South Carolina senator can kick a judge out of office because the judge caught their son stealing, this is why we do what we do here at FITSNews, people. This is why we fight so passionately, not only for those victims, but for the bigger issue, which is fixing a broken system and creating a system that will not continue to create victims, that will, in fact, stand up for those who need it, who deserve it. Count on this news outlet to continue to push our lawmakers and our elected officials to fix our badly broken justice system. The big issues that this news outlet has covered, but we cover a ton of issues at the South Carolina State House related to governance, but we also cover national issues like the border crisis. We cover politics, obviously, and the interplay of all these policy debates on upcoming elections. Now, we interview a lot of people on those various subjects, but it's rare that we interview someone who can seamlessly go between all of those different angles and issues and how they interplay and do it eloquently, do it insightfully, do it with real, authentic, genuine insights on what's happening with all those different issues. Candace Carroll of Americans for Prosperity is one of those people. We've interviewed Candace on a number of occasions down in Walterboro during the Murdaugh trial, where we talked about some pressing state health care issues. We talked to her again in front of the State House a few weeks ago on a bunch of issues that touch on national concerns. Well, this week we sat down with Candace to talk about her group, Americans for Prosperity, and their efforts not only at the South Carolina State House, but on the U.S.-Mexican border and as it relates to the upcoming 2024 presidential election. And as she always does, Candace hit it out of the park. Here's my conversation with Americans for Prosperity's South Carolina State Director, Candace Carroll. But you're absolutely right. Let me ask you that. I'll go ahead and throw a name out there. I've seen him twice. Ron DeSantis, the governor of Florida. Saw him speak in Gilbert when he made his first big swing, saw his comments on reforming the U.S. military. And again, I'll make a joke that'll get me in a little trouble, but I can make it since I'm a little bit on the spectrum. And maybe that's why I like him, because a lot of people say he's on the spectrum too. Not maybe the best communicator, but I've been impressed by the guy. And he seems to be sort of hanging around in that middle tier all by himself. No one really seems to have creeped up to challenge him in that middle tier. Similarly, he has yet to really elevate his candidacy up to challenge Trump. It's kind of this weird, he's just there in the middle situation. Is he one of the ones that perhaps could be the someone?
Perhaps. He did some great things in Florida, right, when it came to education, especially expanding school choice. They have expanded their certificate of need, repeal legislation. I know that they have more things this year that have been repealed. They've expanded a number of things in Florida. Their medical cannabis program just recently got expanded. So there's a lot that he did. I mean, he kept Florida open during
School
COVID.
choice.
School
It's
choice,
huge on
fought
school
back on regulations coming from D.C. But I think, on some other issues, immigration we talked about, right? Like people have questions around his immigration policy. And so, I think that there's an opportunity coming up at the debate of like, okay, how can we hone in on these people and figure out like what is the best direction for the country? So, his name gets tossed around a lot. People ask me about him all the time. People ask me about, former Governor Haley. There were some things that she did really well in South Carolina that people like. Does she have the name recognition across the country? I don't know. She was a former UN ambassador. People know her for that, but do they know like what she did or didn't do, both in the state house and as governor? Same with Tim Scott. What does that look like for folks? He leans into education. He leans into a lot of economic progress opportunities. But then there's other things that people are like, well, I don't really know how he would lead in like a non-senatorial role. What does that potentially look like? Vivek Ramaswamy, all over the place on ESGs, like he's talked about a lot about that, a lot about economic progress. What are some of his other policy, agenda items? So I think it'll be interesting to see, one, who shows up for the debate. We know who's qualified, but who shows? I saw Trump may or may not show.
That's a great question.
So, will he run his own, whatever he wants to call it, at the same time that the debate's going on, or will he be there to debate? Chris Christie has jumped into the race. Like, there's all of these, names that are out there of folks, and so I don't know. We'll see who comes
And
to the
not
top of it
just
all.
who shows up, but who shows up, who brings that A
Correct.
game and is able to, because that's an opportunity for somebody, someone we keep talking about. Well, let me ask you this, and we tried to credit Nikki Haley on this because she has been driving a discussion on entitlement. She's got DeSantis now moving in the right direction on that issue, where previously he was part of that, Trump fold of, let's not touch it and pretend it goes away.
Right.
But, Haley's been talking about that issue, and now DeSantis talking about that issue and having to fix it. And that conversation, as it unfolds, your crystal ball, who do you see potentially breaking through into that second tier, potentially challenging Trump? And do you see eventually an impact of all these indictments on Trump within the Republican Party?
I don't know. I mean, the media would have you believe that like he gets a bump every time an indictment drops. One just dropped yesterday. What does that potentially look like? And there are folks who are, very much Trump loyalists who aren't potentially going to vote for someone else. But then there are voters who we've talked to, a lot who we've talked to in South Carolina, who said, yes, I voted for him before, but I'm open to someone else, depending on what that potentially looks like, what those policies look like that person, is pushing for and supports. As far as someone moving into the second tier, I don't know. I think that we have a big opportunity, as I mentioned, with this debate to figure out, what do people hear? What do they like that they hear? And so I'm interested to see how those polling numbers potentially change after the debate. Entitlements is something that a lot of folks are scared to talk about, but the former governor has been talking about it a lot, and has moved, as you mentioned, she's moved DeSantis and some others. And so, part of the policies that we are pushing is like, one, people can't live under Bidenomics anymore. We definitely don't need 4 more years of that. There's that sense of unease there of like, I don't even know if I can get enough gas to pick my kids up from school, right? Whatever it might be for individuals. And then we have sound policy solutions of like how to fix some of these things as an organization. What does that potentially look like? And there's, as people are leaning into the debate, what do they have to say around immigration, economic progress, healthcare, education, kind of a plethora of issues. But then how does that resonate with people, right? And so I think, my Magic 8 crystal ball, that this is an election where people are going to vote with their wallet, hopefully, and at least say, we can't do 4 more years of Bidenomics. And if it's a Biden-Trump head-to-head, well, we saw what happened in 2020 with that. So, will that happen again? I don't know. Or is there an opportunity to potentially have a different direction for the country?
All right, I want to thank Candace once again for joining us. Look for that full interview on our FITSNews YouTube page coming this week. Be on the lookout for that, the full interview with Candace Carroll. All right, that is a wrap for this week's edition of a very busy week in review. Thank you for tuning in and joining us. I want to let you know a few things, though, before we go. Once again, if you haven't downloaded it already on Apple, Spotify, on Google Podcasts, check out Fitz Files. We dropped our 3rd episode this past week, once again focused on the Rose Petal murder up in the South Carolina upstate, just a tale with all sorts of twists and turns. But if you haven't made that your new home for true crime podcasts, check it out. Fitz Files, Apple, Spotify, Google, wherever you download your podcast, check it out. Also, a programming note. We've got some big changes coming to FITSNews, folks. I'm very excited about them. This is one of our last shows in this studio space. We'll be moving to a new studio in the coming weeks. Be on the lookout for that. And also, even more exciting, some new voices coming to the table. That's right, we're going to have some additional FITSNews crew members to introduce you to in the coming weeks. Can't wait to do that as we continue to grow and continue to hold South Carolina politicians, judges, prosecutors, cops, you name it, and ourselves accountable. Keep it tuned for those announcements in the weeks to come. And also, if you want to help support what we're doing, please subscribe to FITSNews.com. It's just $8 a month. Your subscription is what helps us make all this possible. So keep it tuned to FITSNews.com, and thanks again for checking out our Week in Review.